Page 5 now. The Texas voter ID law, apparently it's racist, at least according to a few lawyers dressed in black robes. A panel of judges from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled that Texas cannot enforce parts of its law that requires voters to show an ID while voting. The reason? These federal judges at least partially agreed with a lower court judge in Texas that the law somehow violates the U.S. Voting Rights Act. In other words, they think that showing a valid ID, like we do when we fly in an aeroplane, discriminates against minorities. How exactly? How is producing the same ID that someone uses to buy beer racist? Join me now on the Daily Ledger Page 5 beat, Stephanie Marie. Stephanie, this ruling out of the Fifth Circuit, I think some people might look at it and say it's a little bit confusing, but we're going to try and peel back the onion here and make sense of it.
Yeah, it's pretty confusing, and 3 out of 4 Americans support voter ID laws. So many are probably wondering the same thing, Graham. And this new ruling from the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans found that Texas law requiring residents to show state-approved IDs in order to cast ballots violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So these 3 judges believe that the law discriminates against minority voters because apparently minorities in the state of Texas have a hard time getting IDs. And the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, says this law was created to ensure the integrity of elections and nothing more.
The United States Supreme Court has already said that voter IDs are perfectly constitutional and they are not racially discriminatory, nor are they that way in Texas either. I personally have prosecuted people who cast votes on behalf of dead people, people who voted twice.
Now, free voting IDs are available from the state, but opponents say getting those cards still puts underlying financial costs on voters, such as paying for birth certificate copies and travel. But the question is, who are these people who don't have IDs, and how exactly do they get around in society?
There's people that just need to renew their ID, but there's also people that need to get their ID for the first time, and people that don't have documents that actually prove their name change or their birth.
Their only option is to get the free election identification certificate the state supplies, but that's not really free because you need a birth certificate to get it, which costs around $25, and you also actually have to go to a Department of Public Safety office to obtain it, and for someone without a car, it's pretty difficult.
The accepted forms of ID in Texas include a driver's license, a U.S. passport, a concealed handgun license, and an election identification certificate issued by the State Department of Public Safety.
Well, how do these people buy beer if they don't have an? I just want to know. I mean, these arguments, they're just ridiculous. But back to the ruling. The way I see it, this thing has now been kicked back down to the lower court by the appellate court, correct?
So in a nutshell, the 3 judges found that Texas ID law was only slightly unconstitutional. So the case will go back to the district court where they'll have to decide whether the legislature intended to discriminate against minorities when they drafted and passed the law.
Well, but you know, as you pointed out, the Supreme Court has already ruled on this. So, you know, it's clear that there's judicial activism going on down here, and it's going to be extremely interesting to see this thing play out. Because when the federal government alludes to the possibility that you're being discriminated against because you're being asked for an ID, then I guess we can conclude that the federal government is racist for asking for IDs when I board an airplane, right?
Right. And you have to remember, you need an ID to purchase a gun. So they try to go through the constitutional perspective here is that, oh, well, it's a constitutional right to vote. Well, it's also a constitutional right to own a gun. So if you have to show an ID to get a gun, then you should have to show an ID to vote. But Democrats love voter fraud. And that's why they are pushing against this law. There are several states that have voter ID laws, and there are other states considering voter ID laws. And Democrats want this stopped before the 2016 election. And we know this for a fact. Hillary Clinton's out on the campaign trail whining about voter ID laws, complaining about how they're racist when really we all know they're not racist.
That's the bottom line. They want dead people to vote just like they do in Chicago. We love Chicago, but dead people vote there. And by the way, the next time a cop pulls me over, when he asks for my driver's license, I'm going to say, you're racist. See how that flies. What else do you have on page 5?
The effort to end regulatory tyranny and the Reins Act. The House passed legislation that could change the way Washington works for the better by a vote of 243 to 165, and this was right before the summer recess. Now, the Reins Act will now be heading to the Senate for a fall vote, and I spoke with Phil Kerpen, who tells me this law would help give Congress more oversight on spending by making the executive branch more accountable to the legislative branch, which could save our country a great deal of money.
This is a bill, H.R. 427 in the House, the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, that would say that for major significant regulations, for economically significant regulations, we ought to follow the constitutional process for lawmaking. What I mean by that is instead of the EPA and the IRS and the FCC and the NLRB and the FDA being able to write regulations and put them directly into effect on the American people, if the Reins Act were passed, these agencies would only be able to propose rules and send them up to Congress for a vote of our elected officials, and they would need to have a majority in the House and Senate and be signed by the president or have a veto override before they could take effect. And so, in other words, Congress would no longer be able to delegate away the important decision-making power for our country's economic policies. They would be forced to have these things come back to them for votes. And of course, they'd still make a lot of mistakes. Congress does a lot of dumb things, but there would be accountability. Because when a major regulation took place, you would be able to look and see exactly who voted for it and who's responsible and hold them accountable come election time.
The Reins Act creates a trigger that forces action when a regulation hits the $100 million level. And Obama has already promised to veto the bill if it gets through the Senate. So this is something that probably won't get signed into law until the next administration.
Okay, so the bottom line is the goal here is to rein in the executive branch, which at times is, like with Obama, is abusing its power over the fourth branch of government.
Well, Obama loves the executive branch, and there's a reason why only 2 House Democrats voted for the Reins law, and it's because that's how they're getting away with a lot of things.
Right.
And they're passing about 3,000 regulations this way a year, and it's costing taxpayers a lot of money, and really there's no one to hold accountable for all of this expense. But like I said, we probably won't see until the next administration, and right now there are several GOP candidates that do support the Reins Act, and it is something that they would have in their administration.
Yeah, I must point out that I think all this doesn't have to be done if they, being the Congress, adheres to the Constitution. I think the solution is already in the Constitution, and that is don't allow a rogue presidency like we have now. Steph, thanks.